Halloran said it loud enough that the whole forecourt heard, which was the point. They keep a fence post next to the royal hawks. I suppose if the birds get bored, they can fly at him for sport. The two falconers with him laughed the way men laugh when they have decided in advance that everything they say is clever. They had come up from the south with their hoods and their lures and their reputations, and they had been at the mews since dawn, telling our master of birds how it was done in the great houses, where men understood hawks. I was standing 4 paces from Corwin Aldous Vane, who held the gate of the lower mews the way he held everything, which is to say as though the world were a still pond, and he intended to leave no ripple in it. I had served beside him a year, and never once heard him answer a man who came to bait him. So I knew he would not answer Halloran. But I was new enough then to feel the heat of it climb my own neck, and old enough already to know that there was nothing I could do, because the man baiting us was the king's guest, and the guest of a king may say what he likes to a guard who is paid to be a wall. This is the part nobody outside the regiment understands about a post like ours. The whole worth of the man on it is that he does not move, not when a tourist leans in, not when a child cries, not when a man with a famous name and 3 falcons hanging from a perch behind him decides, in front of the visiting houses and the master of birds and a clerk with a ledger, that the quiet soldier at the door is the funniest thing he has seen all morning. Vane stood. He did not so much as let his eyes drop to the man, and Halloran, robbed of a reaction, did what such men always do, which was take the silence as proof he had won. I want to tell this properly, because it matters how it ended, and you cannot understand the end unless you understand how small they made him look at the start. The royal mews sat behind the old kitchen court of Wexholt House, a long low building of warm stone with a slate roof gone soft and gray with lichen, and a walled green beyond it where the birds were flown. The house kept hawks the way it kept everything, out of habit older than anyone living, because a king 4 reigns gone had loved them, and his loving them had become a duty, and the duty had outlasted the man until nobody could quite say why we did it except that we always had. There were peregrines and a pair of goshawks and an old saker the falconers called the Lady, who had been flown at 3 coronations and was past flying now and kept only for her dignity. And there was the one bird the southern men had come to see, and to be photographed with, and to take home a little of the glory of. A young peregrine tiercel named Seph, fast as falling, the best the mews had bred in 20 years, and the apple of the master of bird's eye. The display was set for noon. The visiting houses would gather on the walled green, and the falconers would fly the birds to the lure for the guests, and there would be a luncheon after, and somewhere in all of it Halloran and his 2 would stand in the warm light and be admired. They had been admired their whole lives. You could see it in how they moved. "Does it talk?" said the younger of the 2, a narrow man named Pell, walking a slow circle round Vane the way a buyer circles a horse. "Or do they only wind it up for the tourists?" Vane's eyes were on the middle distance, where they were trained to be. The middle distance is a real place to a guardsman. It is just past the nearest face and just short of the far wall, and a good sentry can live there for 2 hours and see everything and look at nothing. Vane lived there now. Pell put his face close to the brim of the bearskin, close enough that a lesser man would have flinched, and Vane did not flinch, and Pell stepped back at last with the small, sour look of a man who has thrown a stone into a well, and waited a long time for the splash that never came. "Leave it, Pell," said Halloran, not because he was kinder but because he had grown bored. "It's furniture. You don't insult a coat rack." The master of birds, a stooped, gentle old man named Edrec Ames, who had spent his life among feathers and was not built for the company of men like these, came out then, wringing his hands in the way he had, and tried to draw them off toward the green. He was frightened of them. I could see it. They had spent the morning correcting him, telling him his birds were overfed, his perches wrong, his methods a generation behind, and old Ames had nodded and apologized and let them, because he was a soft man and they were loud ones, and the house had told him to make the guests happy. There is a particular cruelty in loud men towards soft ones, and these three had it. "The tiercel," Halloran was saying as Ames led them off. "I'll fly him myself at noon. Show your people what he can really do. You've been flying him like a pigeon." He is particular, sir," Ames said. "He knows his own man, he is young. He has only flown to." "He'll fly to proper falconer," Halloran said, "or he'll learn to, they all do." There was one more thing before they went, and it is worth telling, because it is the kind of small cruelty that shows you what a man is. As they turned for the green, Halloran reached out and tapped the muzzle of Vane's rifle with the back of his glove, a little flick, the way you might tap a railing in passing, and he said to his men, loud, "Careful, it might be loaded. Or it might be hollow, like the man." And the two of them laughed again, and old Ames flinched at the laugh more than Vane did, and a boy of about 10 among the visiting families, the son of one of the houses, I learned later, looked up at his father with a frown that children get when they have just watched a grown man be unkind for sport and cannot understand why the other grown men are laughing. That boy mattered later, in his small way. Children always see the cruelty clearest, because nobody has yet taught them to call it cleverness. And they went off toward the green, and the morning rolled on toward noon, and Vane stood his gate, and I stood mine, and neither of us said a word because that was the work. But I will tell you what I learned much later, long after, when the thing was done and we were standing off duty in the dark of the guardroom, and I asked him at last what he had been thinking while that narrow man walked his circle. He looked at me a while. Then he said, "I was thinking the tiercel wouldn't fly for that man, and I was thinking about who would have to catch him when he didn't." That was all. But it was the first time I understood that there was a great deal more inside Corwin Vane than the wall the rest of them saw. Noon came bright and high. They flew the goshawks first, to the fist, short flights down the green and back, and the visiting houses made the soft, pleased sounds that audiences make, and the falconers bowed, and old Ames stood at the side with the spare lures and his heart in his face. Then they brought the lady out, the old saker, not to fly her but only to show her, and she sat the glove and turned her hooded head to the sound of the crowd and was, even blind under the leather, the most dignified thing on that green. And then it was the tiercel's turn, and Halloran would not let Ames cast him. "I'll do it," he said, and took the bird up onto his own glove, and old Ames opened his mouth and shut it again, because what was he against a king's guest? The tiercel sat the strange fist, and you could see even from the gate that he did not like it. A bird like that knows a hand the way a man knows a voice. He had been gentled and flown and fed and called home 1,000 times by people who loved him, and now he sat on the glove of a man who had never spoken to him kindly in his life and intended to make him perform. Halloran swung the lure and slipped the leash and cast him off. For a moment it was beautiful, and I think even Halloran believed it would go his way, because the tiercel went up the way that bird always went up, like something the ground had been holding down and suddenly let go of, climbing in long, fast rings until he was a dark flake against the high blue. The crowd made its sound. Halloran swung the lure and called. And the tiercel did not come. He hung up there in the wind, and he heard the wrong voice on the lure, and he did the thing a young hawk does when the world stops being one he understands. He broke off the rings and slid sideways down the wind, fast, low over the wall, and was gone over the rooftops of the kitchen court toward the open country beyond the house, and the lure swung and called him, and meant nothing to him at all, because the man swinging it was a stranger and the bird had had enough. I have seen a crowd go quiet in 100 ways. This was the bad kind. Old Ames made a sound like something breaking. Halloran stood with the lure still turning in his hand, and his face doing several things at once, none of them clever. And his two falconers, the men who had spent the morning explaining hawks to everyone, ran for their own birds and their own lures, because a lost royal peregrine is not a small thing. It is the loss of 20 years of breeding and the favorite of the house, and a bird worth more than all 3 Southern men put together. And they knew, the way professionals know, that the next quarter hour decided whether he came home or was gone for good into the wide, hungry country where a tame bird does not last long. They tried, I will give them that much. They flew their own falcons up to try to draw him. They swung lures from the high points of the green. They shouted the calls that work in the South. And old Ames staggered about with his face gray and his hands shaking, calling the bird by the soft name he used for him in the dark of the mews, and none of it brought the tiercel back. He had gone up out of all of it. You would catch a glimpse of him now and then, a dark stroke crossing a gap between roofs, going further out each time, and each time old Ames made that small breaking sound, and each time Halloran's face got harder and smaller, because he had begun to understand that the most expensive thing in the house was being lost in front of everyone by his own hand. And through all of it, 4 paces from the gate, Corwin Vane stood his post and watched the sky. I do not think anyone else saw him do it. The whole green was a churn of running men and swung lures and the rising noise of a crowd that has gone from pleasure to dread. But I was beside him and I saw. He did not run. He did not shout. He stood exactly where the regiment had set him, rifle at his side, eyes up, and he watched the tiercel the way a man reads a page, the climb, the slide, the long arcs out and the small drift back, the places the bird kept returning to in the high air over the kitchen court. He watched it the way none of the running men were watching it, because they were watching their own lures and their own failure, and he was watching the bird. Once low I heard him speak. Not to me, to no one, he said, "He's not gone, he's just lost his man." And I did not understand it then. I should say what those minutes were like, because the length of them is the thing. A bird is lost in a moment, but it is recovered, if it is recovered at all, over a long stretch span of failing chances. And every minute that span runs on is a minute the tame thing forgets a little more that it ever had a man. The Southern men knew this. It was why they ran so hard at the start and why the running emptied out of them so fast. The first lure swings have a chance. The 10th has less. By the 20th the bird is a wild creature with the memory of the glove fading out of it like warmth out of a stone, and the men swinging the lures have begun, in the private rooms of their own heads, to count the bird as gone and to think instead about how they will explain it. I watched that change come over Halloran's too. I watched the moment each of them stopped flying to bring the bird home and started flying, so that no one could say they had not tried. There is a difference, and it shows in the shoulders. The first quarter hour died. The visiting houses had stopped pretending this was a display, and started murmuring the way crowds murmur when a thing has plainly gone wrong. Halloran's 2 falconers came in off the green at last, blown and beaten, their own birds back on the perch, and they stood in a knot near the lure trolley arguing in low, hard voices about whether there was any point going on, and I heard the older one, Pell, say the thing that ended their pride for good. He said, "Nobody's bringing that bird down. Not us, not anyone. He's a wild thing again now. He'll be 20 miles out by dark." And old Ames heard it, and sat down on the lure trolley as though his legs had been cut, and put his face in his shaking hands. That was the moment. I want you to hold it because everything turns on it. 3 of the most celebrated falconers in the country had just declared, out loud in front of the house, that the bird could not be recovered. The men who had spent the whole morning telling everyone they were the only people present who understood hawks had reached the end of what they understood, and were calling it impossible. And the master of birds, who loved the tiercel, believed them, and was sitting with his face in his hands while the best peregrine in 20 years drifted further out over the country with every gust. I looked at Vane. I do not know why. Habit, perhaps, the way you look to the steadiest man in a room when the room is coming apart. He had taken 1 step off his post. Now you have to understand what that step was. A guardsman does not leave his post. It is the first thing they put into you and the last thing that ever comes out. The post is the whole of you. You hold it through rain and insult and aching cold and the worst hours of the night, and you do not step off it for a falling bird or a falling sky, because the moment a sentry decides for himself when the post matters, the post is already lost. I had seen Vane stand through things that would have moved a statue. I had seen him take the Southern men's contempt all morning without the twitch of an eyelid. And now, with no order given and the regiment's first law in his ears, he had taken one slow step out of the place they had set him. I started toward him to stop him. That was my duty, God help me, to keep my brother at his post. And the sergeant of the watch, old Maddock, came round the corner of the mews at the same moment, having heard the noise and saw Vane off his post, and opened his mouth to put him back on it with the flat, hard word that does not get argued with. And then Maddock saw Vane's face and shut his mouth and did not say the word. I have thought about that a great deal in the years since. Maddock had 30 years in. He had broken younger men for far less than a step off post, and he looked at Corwin Vane standing one pace into the green with his eyes still up on the bird, and something in what he saw made him swallow the order whole. Later I asked him too. Maddock is dead now, so I can tell it. He said, I'd heard a thing about that man when they posted him to us. I never believed it. Standing there, I believed it. And he would not say what the thing was. He told me to ask Vane, and Vane, when I asked, only said that some men carry a trade the way other men carry a scar under the cloth, where you'd never know it was there until the day it had to come out. Sergeant, Vane said, quiet, not asking, telling. I need the gauntlet off the lady's perch, and I need everyone on that green to be still. Every man, every voice, 2 minutes of nothing. And old Maddock, 30 years in, who put men back on their posts for breathing wrong, looked at him another moment, and then turned to the green and gave the order in the voice that carries to the back of a parade. Still, everybody. Lures down, voices off, now. It is a strange thing to watch a churning crowd freeze. The running stopped. The falconers stood where they were with their dead lures hanging. Old Ames lifted his gray face out of his hands. The visiting houses fell quiet the way a room falls quiet when a man who knows what he is doing finally walks in, even before they know who he is or what he means to do. And into that sudden, enormous stillness, Corwin Vane handed me his rifle. He handed it to me the way you hand a man something you trust him to hold, both hands, no fuss. And I took it because there was nothing else in the world to do. And then he pulled the white glove off his right hand and dropped it in my palm on top of the rifle, and took the heavy worn falconer's gauntlet old Maddock had fetched from the lady's perch, and drew it on, and worked his fingers in it once to seat it. The way a man does a thing his hands have done 10,000 times before they ever did anything else. I had never seen Vane's bare hand. I want to say that plainly, because it is the small thing I noticed in the great moment, and the small thing told the truth before the great one did. The back of that hand was a map of old white scars, the fine crossed lines a hawk's foot leaves over years and years, the marks of a man who has carried birds since he was a boy, long before he ever wore our red, long before the bearskin, long before any of us knew him as the fence post by the lower gate. The Southern men did not see it. They were looking at his face. But I held his rifle and his white glove, and I looked at his bare, scarred hand drawing on the gauntlet, and I understood, before he had done a single thing, that the quiet man we had all been told was furniture had been a falconer before he had been anything at all. He did not climb a high point, he did not swing a lure, he did not call. He walked slowly out to the middle of the green where the grass was clear, into the full open under the high blue where the tiercel could see him, and he stood there. He stood there exactly the way he stood his post, still, square, eyes up, a man perfectly at rest in the center of a held breath. He'll not come to that, I heard Pell say low, but the green was so quiet now that low carried, and old Maddock turned his head and Pell shut his mouth. Vane raised the gauntleted fist, not high, just up level, an offering held steady against the empty sky, and then he did the thing I have never forgotten, the thing that is the whole of this story if you take everything else away. He whistled. It was not loud. It was not a falconer's shrill summoning call like the southern men used, the call that works on a trained bird that has learned a system. It was a low rising note, soft, then a pause, then the same note again, then a third, a small private music with a shape to it, the kind of thing that is not a command at all but a name. It was the sound, I understood much later, that this one bird and this one man had made between them, except that this one bird had never met this one man before that day. It was older than that. It was the sound a hawk learns from the first hand that ever fed it in the dark, the sound that means not come here but you are safe now, the hand is back, the world is one you understand again. Vane did not know the tiercel, but Vane knew hawks. He knew the one true thing that the loud men with the famous names had forgotten somewhere on the road to being famous, that you do not bring a frightened bird down by being the best falconer. You bring it down by being the calm in the middle of a sky that has suddenly gone strange, the one still point a lost thing can steer toward. High up, the dark stroke that had been drifting further out with every gust stopped drifting out. I felt the whole green feel it. 300 people who a moment before had given the bird up for gone stood frozen and watched a flake of darkness in the high blue stop going away. It hung there. It turned. And old Ames on the lure trolley made a different sound than before, a small caught sound, because he had spent his life among these birds and he knew, before any of the southern men knew, what it meant when a runaway hawk turns and holds. Vane whistled the low rising name again, held the fist, did not move. The tiercel came down the sky in long sliding arcs, not the panicked sideways slide of before, but the questioning circle of a bird working out whether to believe what it has heard, lower each time, closer each time, and each time it came round. Vane held the fist and made the soft sound and was the one unmoving thing in a world that had frightened it. And each time the bird believed the still man a little more than it had the past before. "Hold the line," Vane said, very low, not to the bird, to the people. "Nobody move, he's deciding." Nobody moved. I have stood in cathedrals with less silence in them. The southern falconers stood with their lures dead at their sides and watched a thing they had said could not be done being done by a man they had spent the morning calling a coat rack. And I will give Halloran this one thing. I saw his face, and there was no anger left in it now, only the white stunned stillness of a man watching the floor of his whole life tilt. The tiercel came round one last time, low over the wall, the wind off his wings stirring the grass, and dropped, and there was a beat where I think every soul on that green stopped breathing. And then the bird threw up its wings and came down onto the gauntleted fist of Corwin Vane as softly as a leaf settling, as though it had been coming home to that exact hand its whole short life, and had only got lost on the way. And Vane closed his bare scarred fingers over the jesses, and brought the bird in against his chest out of the wind, and bent his head down to it, and I saw his lips move, and I have always believed, though I was too far to hear and never asked, that he was telling it the same thing the still point always tells the lost thing. You're safe now. You're relieved. The green did not cheer. That is the part people never believe when I tell it. There was no roar, no applause breaking out. There was instead a long-held silence that was somehow louder than any cheer, the silence of 300 people who have just watched something they did not have the words for, and then, here and there, the soft sound of people letting out a breath they had been holding for a quarter of an hour. Old Ames was weeping openly and not ashamed of it. And the 3 southern falconers stood in their knot by the trolley and said absolutely nothing at all, because there was nothing in their whole storehouse of famous knowledge that had a word for what the silent soldier had just done. Vane carried the tiercel back across the green to old Ames, slow and easy so as not to startle the bird, and he did not carry it like a trophy. He carried it like a thing he was returning to its rightful keeper, which is exactly what he was doing. He stopped in front of the old man and he waited, and Ames stood up off the trolley with his face still wet, and Vane transferred the bird onto the old man's own glove with the small turning motion that lets a hawk step from one fist to another without alarm, and the tiercel stepped across to the hand it knew, The soft voice it knew, and settled, and was home. "He's not hurt," Vane said quietly. "He's not even tired. He only got frightened by a strange hand and a strange voice up where it's a long way down. He'll fly clean for you tomorrow. Don't let anyone fly him who hasn't talked to him first." It was the longest speech I had heard him make in a year of standing beside him, and he made it to a weeping old man about a bird, in a voice so low the visiting houses leaned in to hear it. Ames could not speak. He put his free hand on Vane's arm and gripped it, and Vane let him, and that was the thanks, and it was enough. It was the master of birds who said the thing, in the end, that put the morning into words for everyone standing there. He looked up from the tiercel on his fist, and he looked at the 3 Southern men who had spent the whole day correcting him, and he said, in his soft, cracked voice that nonetheless carried clean across that silent green, 20 years I have read everything written about hawks. I never knew there was a man living who could call a strange bird down out of the open sky to a hand it had never met. I thought it was a thing they only wrote about in the old books." He turned back to Vane. "Where did you learn that?" And Vane, who had not answered Halloran's mockery, who had taken Pell's circling without a flicker, who had stood all morning as a wall, while the loud men explained his own art to him in his own house, and never said a word, Vane answered the soft old man honestly, because the soft old man had asked honestly. "My father was the falconer to a country house," he said. "Before me, his father. I was carrying a bird before I could carry a bucket. I had a young eyas of my own, a tiercel like this one, when I was 9. I learned to call them down the way you learn to walk, too early to remember not knowing how." He looked down at the bird on Ames's glove. "Then the house failed and the birds were sold and there was no living in it, so I took the king's shilling and stood his gate, and I have stood it 12 years, and in all that time nobody ever asked me whether I knew one end of a hawk from the other. They asked the men with the famous names." He said it without a grain of bitterness. That was the thing that undid me, standing there with his rifle and his white glove in my hands. He was not paying anybody back. He was just answering the old man's question, and the answer happened to be the truth that had been standing 4 paces from the gate the whole long morning, while 3 celebrated falconers explained to a house full of guests that the quiet soldier was furniture. I will tell you about the 3 men now, because the heart of a morning like this is in the humbling, and I owe it to the truth to say exactly how they took it, and it was not what I expected. Pell, the narrow one who had walked his slow circle round Vane, and asked whether it talked, Pell could not look at him. He stood with his lure wound round his hand and his eyes on the grass, and when the crowd began at last to move and murmur and break, he slipped to the edge of the green and stood apart, a man who had said out loud that the bird could not be brought down, and then watched it brought down by the man he had circled like a horse, and he carried that the rest of the day like a stone in his coat. The younger one simply went quiet, the way young men do when the floor they have been told to stand on turns out to be someone else's. But Halloran, who had called him a fence post, who had taken the tiercel onto his own glove against old Ames's stammered warning, and lost the best bird in 20 years out of sheer certainty that any hawk would fly to a proper falconer or learn to, Halloran did the one thing I had not thought a man like that had in him. He crossed the green. He walked through the breaking crowd, past his own 2 men, and he came and stood in front of Corwin Vane, and the whole house watched him do it, and he took off his hat. "I have flown hawks for 30 years, he said, and his voice was not loud now. It was the smallest I had heard it all day. "I have flown in the great houses. I have won every prize there is to win. And I have never, not once, seen the thing you just did, and I told these people all morning that I was the only man here who understood birds." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I lost that tiercel because I was too proud to ask the old man how he liked to be cast. You brought him down because you weren't too proud to stand still and be small until a frightened thing decided to trust you." He held out his hand. "I owe you an apology, and I owe him one." He looked at old Ames, and I'll give it where everyone who heard me this morning can hear me give it." And he did. He turned to the visiting houses and he said it plainly that he had been a fool, that he had mocked a better falconer than himself because the man wore a soldier's coat instead of a falconer's, and that he had nearly cost the house its finest bird out of vanity, and he asked old Ames's pardon. And Ames, who was the gentlest man on that green, gave it at once and fully, because soft men are like that, and it is their strength and not their weakness. Vane took the offered hand. Of course he did. He was never out to win anything off Halloran. There was nothing in him that needed the man brought low. He shook his hand once firm, and then he said the only thing he said to any of the three of them all day, and he said it quietly, almost kindly, which was worse for Halloran than any blow could have been. "You're a good falconer," Vane said. "You proved that flying the goshawks this morning. I watched you. Your hands are good. You only forgot the one thing." He nodded toward the tiercel, settled now and calm on the old man's fist. "A hawk doesn't care what you've won. It cares whether you'll be still for it." He let go of Halloran's hand. "Most men forget that about more than hawks." Then Corwin Vane took his white glove back out of my hands and pulled it on over the scarred hand the southern men had never thought to look at, and took his rifle, and walked the 4 paces back to the gate of the lower mews, and stood his post, eyes to the middle distance, as though he had never left it. He had been gone from it perhaps 10 minutes. Old Maddock entered it in the log as absent from post, 10 minutes, by direction of the sergeant of the watch, to recover royal property, which was as much truth as a logbook can hold and not a word of the real truth at all, and Maddock knew it, and signed it anyway, and that was the last either of them ever officially said about it. But the real truth did not stay in the logbook. You cannot put a morning like that in front of 300 people and have it stay anywhere. By evening the whole house knew, and by the next week the country round about knew, the way these things travel, and a man came up from one of the papers wanting the story of the soldier who called the king's lost hawk out of the sky, and Vane would not see him. He sent word down through Maddock that there was no story, that the bird had got frightened and been brought home, that any man raised to it could have done the same, which was a lie, and the kindest sort of lie, the sort a modest man tells to be left alone. The paper ran something anyway, 3 lines and no name, because Vane would not give them a name, and the 3 lines made it sound smaller than it was, and Vane was glad of that. I asked him, that night in the dark of the guardroom, the question I had been carrying all day. I asked him why he had never told any of us, a year I had stood beside him, that he had been a falconer, that he could do what he had done, that the thing the loud men spent the whole morning saying he could not possibly understand was the first thing he had ever understood in his life. He was a long time answering. Then he said, "Because it isn't the post." And when I waited, he said it more fully, in the most words I ever got out of him at one time. "The post doesn't care what I was. The post cares whether I'll hold it. A man who stands a gate well because of what he used to be is standing it for the wrong reason, and he'll let it slip the first day nobody's praising him for the old thing. I hold the gate because it's the gate." He turned the white glove over in his hands. "The hawks were a gift I was given and then lost when the house failed. I made my peace with losing them a long time ago. I didn't keep quiet to be modest. I kept quiet because the day I start needing men to know what I was is the day I've stopped being any good at what I am." He put the glove away. "And anyway," he said, and this was as close to a smile as Corwin Vane ever came, "I'd have stood there and let that narrow one walk his circle round me till the sun went down. It was only the bird that got me off my post. A man's pride isn't worth a step. A frightened thing with nowhere to land, that's worth a step. There's a difference, and a guard who can't feel the difference shouldn't be on a gate. There is one more thing, and then I am done, because it is the thing I think of oftenest and it has the boy in it." A week after, the visiting houses came back through on their way south, and the boy who had frowned at the cruelty came too, and his father brought him to the lower gate, and the boy stood in front of Corwin Vane, who was on his post, eyes to the middle distance, A wall again to everyone who did not know better, and the boy did not say anything for a while, the way children go shy in front of the thing they have come to see. Then he held up his hand. He had made himself a glove out of an old leather workmitt of his father's, too big for him, the fingers flopping, and he had been practicing. His father told me, the low rising whistle, the nate command sound, all the week home and back, getting it wrong and a little less wrong. He held up the great floppy glove to the silent soldier, and he whistled it, the small private name shape, as near as a boy of 10 can get it, and he looked up with the whole of his hope in his face to see whether he had got it right. And Corwin Vane broke his post. Not far, he never broke it far. He brought his eyes down off the middle distance onto the boy, which is a thing a sentry is not to do, and he looked at the great clumsy glove and the small earnest face, and he gave one small nod. Yes, that's the shape of it, you've nearly got it. And then, so quiet that only the boy and his father and I could hear, he said, lower on the second note, and mean it. They can tell when you mean it. And then his eyes went back up to the middle distance, and the wall closed over the man again, and the boy went off down the road toward the south, holding his glove against his chest like something alive, practicing the second note lower, meaning it. His father told me, a year on by letter, that the boy was at a Falconers in the south now, apprenticed, the youngest they had taken in a generation, and that he was good, uncommonly good, and that the master there had said the strangest thing about him, that the boy had a stillness in him you could not teach, that birds came to his hand that came to no one else's, and where had a child got a thing like that? The father wrote that he had never told the master. He had only written to tell me because I had been there, and because he thought the soldier ought to know, though he doubted the soldier would let himself be told, that a thing given away quietly on a gate, in 10 words to a boy with a floppy glove, had not been lost the way Vane's own birds were lost when the house failed, but had gone on and would go on, into hands not yet born. I told Vane, of course I told him you cannot sit on a thing like that. He listened and he did not smile quite, and he said only, good, and then after a while, looking at the middle distance, that's the one that doesn't get lost. The teaching, the birds you have to give back. The teaching stays. And that was all he ever said about it, and it was the proudest I ever heard him, which is to say not proud at all, only quietly glad in the way of a man who has put a true thing into the world and asked nothing for it. I have stood a good many posts in the years since, in rain and cold and the long bad hours of the night, and I have been mocked at 1 or 2 of them by men who were sure the quiet soldier in front of them was a thing with nothing inside it. And every time, I have thought of Corwin Vane standing all morning as a wall, while 3 famous men explained his own art to him and never said a word, and then taking one slow step off his post, not for his pride, which they had spent the day grinding, but for a frightened bird that had lost its man and was drifting out alone over the wide hungry country, with nobody calm enough to call it home. That is the part the 3 lines in the paper never caught, and the part I have carried ever since. The loud men thought the measure of a falconer was what he could make a bird do. Vane knew the measure was whether a lost and frightened creature that owed him nothing and had never met him would choose in the end to come down out of the whole enormous sky and trust his hand. They had spent their lives being admired. He had spent his learning to be still enough that something afraid could believe in him. And on a bright noon on a walled green behind an old stone mews, in front of everyone who had laughed at him, the hawk came down, not to the famous men, not to the lures, not to the names, only to him. Only ever to him.